My Friend Flicka by Mary O'Hara, Chapter 18. When Ken opened his eyes next morning and looked out, he saw that the house was wrapped in fog. There had been no rain at all since the day a week ago when the wind had torn the sprinkling system to pieces and blown all the tattered clouds away. That was the day he had found Flicka, and it had been terribly hot since then. They had hardly been able to stand the sun out on the terrace. They had gone swimming in the pool every day. On the hills, the grass was turning to soft tan. Now there were clouds, and they had closed down. After a severe hot spell, there often came a heavy fog, or hail, or even snow. Standing at the window, Ken could hardly see the pines on the hill opposite. He wondered if his father would go after the yearlings in such a fog as this. They wouldn't be able to see them. But at breakfast, McLachlan said there would be no change of plans. It was just a big cloud that had settled down over the ranch. It would lift and fall. Perhaps up on Saddleback it would be clear. They mounted and rode out. The fog lay in the folds of the hills. Here and there a bare summit was in sunshine. Then a little farther on came a smother of cottony white that soaked the four riders to the skin and hung rows of moonstones on the whiskers of the horses. It was hard to keep track of each other. Suddenly Ken was lost. The others had vanished. He reined in Shorty and sat listening. The clouds and mist rolled around him. He felt as if he were alone in the world. A bluebird, colour of the deep blue wild delphinium that dots the plains, became interested in him and perched on a bush nearby. And as he started Shorty forward again, the bluebird followed along, hopping from bush to bush. The boy rode slowly, not knowing in which direction to go. Then, hearing shouts, he touched heels to Shorty and cantered, and suddenly came out of the fog and saw his father and Tim and Ross. "There they are," said McLachlan, pointing down over the curve of the hill. They rode forward, and Ken could see the yearlings standing bunched at the bottom, looking up, wondering who was coming. Then a huge coil of fog swirled over them, and they were lost to sight again. McLachlan told them to circle around, spread out fanwise on the far side of the colts, and then gently bear down on them so they would start towards the ranch. If the colts once got running in this fog, he said, there'd be no chance of catching them. The plan worked well. The yearlings were not as frisky as usual, and allowed themselves to be driven in the right direction. It was only when they were on the county road and near the gate where Howard was watching that Ken, whose eyes had been scanning the bunch as they appeared and disappeared in the fog, realized that Flicka was missing. McLachlan noticed it at the same moment, and as Ken rode towards his father, McLachlan turned to him and said, "She's not in the bunch." They sat in silence a few moments while McLachlan planned the next step. The yearlings, dispirited by the fog, nibbled languidly at the grass by the roadside. McLachlan looked at the saddleback, and Ken looked too, the passionate desire in his heart reaching out to pierce the fog and the hillside and see where Flicka had hidden herself away. Had she been with the bunch when they first were found? Had she stolen away through the fog? Or hadn't she been there in the beginning? Had she run away from the ranch entirely after her bad experience a week ago? Or, and this thought made his heart drop sickeningly, had she perhaps died of the hurts she had received when she broke out of the corral and was lying stark and riddled with ants and crawling things on the breast of one of those hills? McLachlan looked grim. "Lone wolf, like her mother," he said. "Never with the gang. I might have known it." Ken remembered what the colonel had said about the lone wolf type. It wasn't good to be that way. "Well, we'll drive the yearlings back up," said Rob finally. "No chance of finding her alone. If they happen to pass anywhere near her, she's likely to join them." They drove the yearlings back. Once over the first hill, the colts got running and soon were out of sight. The fog closed down again so that Ken pulled up, unable to see where he was going, unable to see his father, or Ross, or Tim. He sat listening, astonished that the sound of their hoofs had been wiped out so completely. Again he seemed alone in the world. The fog lifted in front of him and showed him that he stood at the brink of a sharp drop, almost a precipice, though not very deep. It led down into a semicircular pocket on the hillside which was fed by a spring. There was a clump of young cottonwoods and a great bank of clover dotted with small yellow blossoms. In the midst of the clover stood Flicka, quietly feasting. She had seen him before he saw her, and was watching him, her head up, clover sticking out of both sides of her mouth, her joys going busily. At sight of her, Ken was incapable of either thought or action. Suddenly, from behind him in the fog, he heard his father's low voice. "Don't move." "How'd she get in there?" said Tim. "She scrambled down this bank, and she could scramble up again if we weren't here." "I think we've got her," said McLaughlin. "Other side of that pocket the ground drops 20 feet sheer," said Tim. "She can't go down there." Flicka had stopped chewing. There were still stalks of clover sticking out between her jaws, but her head was up and her ears pricked, listening, and there was a tautness and tension in her whole body. Ken found himself trembling too. "How are you going to catch her, Dad?" he asked in a low voice. "I can snag her from here," said Ross. And in the same breath McLaughlin answered, "Ross can rope her. Might as well rope her here as in the corral. We'll spread out in a semicircle above this bank. She can't get past us, and she can't get down." They took their positions, and Ross lifted his rope off the horn of his saddle. Ahead of them, far down below the pocket, the yearlings were running. A whinny or two drifted up, and the sound of their hoofs muffled by the fog. Flicka heard them too. Suddenly she was aware of danger. She leaped out of the clover to the edge of the precipice, which fell away down the mountainside towards where the yearlings were running. But it was too steep and too high. She came straight up on her hind legs with a neigh of terror, and whirled back towards the bank down which she had slid to reach the pocket. But on the crest of it, looming uncannily in the fog, were 4 black figures. She screamed and ran around the base of the bank. Ken heard Ross's rope sing. It snaked out just as Flicka dived into the bank of clover. Stumbling, she went down, and for a moment was lost to view. "Gol darn," said Ross, hauling in his rope, while Flicka floundered up and again circled her small prison, hurling herself at every point, only to realize that there was no way out. She stood over the precipice, poised in despair and frantic longing. There drifted up the sound of the colts running below. Flicka trembled and strained over the brink. A perfect target for Ross, and he whirled his lariat again. It made a vicious whine. Ken longed for the filly to escape the noose, yet he longed for her capture. Flicka reared up, her delicate 4 feet beat the air, then she leaped out, and Ross's rope fell short again. As McLaughlin said, "I expected that. She's like all the rest of them." Flicka went down like a diver. She hit the ground with her legs folded under her, then rolled and bounced the rest of the way. It was exactly like the bronco that had climbed over the side of the truck and rolled down the 40-foot bank. And in silence, the 4 watchers sat in their saddles waiting to see what would happen when she hit bottom. Ken already thinking of the Winchester, and the way the crack of it had echoed back from the hills. Flicka lit, it seemed, on 4 steel springs that tossed her up and sent her flying down the mountainside. Perfection of speed and power and action. A hot sweat bathed Ken from head to foot, and he began to laugh, half choking. The wind roared down and swept up the fog, and it went bounding away over the hills, leaving trailing streamers of white in the gullies, and coverlets of cotton around the bushes. Way below they could see Flicka galloping towards the yearlings. In a moment she joined them. and then there was just a many-coloured blur of moving shapes, with a fierce sun blazing down, striking sparks of light off their glossy coats. "Get going," shouted McLachlan. "Get around behind them. They're on the run now, and it's cleared. Keep them running, and we may get them all in together before they stop. Tim, you take the short way back to the gate and help Howard turn them and get them through." Tim shot off towards the county road, and the other three riders galloped down and around the mountain until they were at the back of the band of yearlings. Shouting and yelling and spurring their mounts, they kept the colts running, circling them around towards the ranch until they had them on the county road. Way ahead, Ken could see Tim and Howard at the gate, blocking the road. The yearlings were bearing down on them. Now McLachlan slowed up and began to call, "Whoa! Whoa!" and the pace decreased. Often enough, the yearlings had swept down that road and through the gate and down to the corrals. It was the pathway to oats and hay and shelter from winter storms. Would they take it now? Flicka was with them, right in the middle. If they went, would she go too? It was all over almost before Ken could draw a breath. The yearlings turned at the gate, swept through, went down to the corrals on a dead run, and through the gates that Gus had opened. Flicka was caught again. Mindful that she had clawed her way out when she was corralled before, McLachlan determined to keep her in the main corral until which the stable door opened. It had 8-foot walls of aspen poles. The rest of the yearlings must be manoeuvred away from her. Now that the fog had gone, the sun was scorching, and horses and men alike were soaked with sweat before the chasing was over, and, one after the other, the yearlings had been driven into the other corral, and Flicka was alone. She knew that her solitude meant danger, and that she was singled out for some special disaster. She ran frantically to the high fence through which she could see the other ponies standing, and reared and clawed at the poles. She screamed, whirled, circled the corral first in one direction and then the other, and while McLachlan and Ross were discussing the advisability of roping her, she suddenly espied the dark hole which was the open upper half of the stable door, and dived through it. McLachlan rushed to close it, and she was caught, safely imprisoned in the stable. The rest of the colts were driven away, and Ken stood outside the stable, listening to the wild hoofs beating, the screams, the crashes, his Flicka within there, close at hand, imprisoned. He was shaking. He felt a desperate desire to quiet her somehow, to tell her, if she only knew how he loved her, that there was nothing to be afraid of, that they were going to be friends. Ross shook his head with a one-sided grin. "Sure a wild one," he said, coiling his lariat. "Plumb loco," said Tim briefly. McLachlan said, "We'll leave her to think it over. After dinner we'll come up and feed and water her and do a little work with her." But when they went up after dinner, there was no Flicka in the barn. One of the windows above the manger was broken, and the manger was full of pieces of glass. Staring at it, McLachlan gave a short laugh. He looked at Ken. She climbed into the manger, see? Stood on the feed box, beat the glass out with her front hoofs, and climbed through. The window opened into the 6-foot pasture. Near it was a wagon load of hay. When they went around the back of the stable to see where she had gone, they found her between the stable and the hay wagon, eating. At their approach, she leaped away, then headed east across the pasture. "If she's like her mother," said Rob, "she'll go right through the wire." "I bet she'll go over," said Gus. "She yumps like a deer." "No horse can jump that," said McLachlan. Ken said nothing because he could not speak. It was the most terrible moment of his life. He watched Flicka racing towards the eastern wire. A few rods from it, she swerved, turned, and raced diagonally south. "It turned her! It turned her!" cried Ken, almost sobbing. It was the first sign of hope for Flicka. "Oh, Dad, she has got sense! She has! She has!" Flicka turned again as she met the southern boundary of the pasture. Again at the northern, she avoided the barn, without abating anything of her whirlwind speed, following a precise, accurate calculation, and turning each time on a dime. She investigated every possibility. Then, seeing that there was no hope, she raced south towards the range where she had spent her life, gathered herself, and rose to the impossible leap. Each of the men watching had the impulse to cover his eyes, and Ken gave a howl of despair. 20 yards of fence came down with her as she hurled herself through. Caught on the upper strands, she turned a complete somersault, landing on her back, her forelegs dragging the wires down on top of her, and tangling herself in them beyond hope of escape. The wire, cursed McLaughlin. If I could afford decent fences. Ken followed the men miserably as they walked to the filly. They stood in a circle, watching while she kicked and fought and thrashed until the wire was tightly wound and tangled about her, piercing and tearing her flesh and hide. At last she was unconscious, streams of blood running on her golden coat, and pools of crimson widening on the grass beneath. With the wire cutters, which Gus always carried in the hip pocket of his overalls, he cut the wire away, and they drew her into the pasture, repaired the fence, placed hay, a box of oats, and a tub of water near her, and called it a day. I doubt if she pulls out of it, said McLaughlin briefly, but it's just as well. If it hadn't been this way, it would have been another. A loco horse